The rain came down in a steady, polite hush that January night, the kind that made the city slow its breath and tuck itself closer around lamps and windows. Inside the little cafe on the corner, the light was warm enough to seem like an invitation. Jack Rowan moved through that light as he always did, slow, purposeful, hands remembering each cup and saucer like an old prayer. He polished the counter until the wood caught the glow from the street, and his movements built a kind of comfort for regulars who liked routine more than noise. There was an empty chair at the corner table, a small, silent witness to a life that had changed. Jack had left it untouched for years, an old wooden chair with a slight wobble, the place where Sarah had once insisted on sitting so she could see everyone who came in. Her photograph hung on the wall above it, a soft snapshot of a woman in a nurse's uniform, hair tied back, laughing at something only she could see. Jack often caught himself talking to that photograph in the evenings, not with sermons or answers, but with the simple domestic facts of living. "Closed early tonight," he'd mutter, or "left an extra loaf in the back." It felt less like conversation and more like keeping a promise to the face that still held his memory. Just after 8, the bell over the door gave a weak tinkle and two shapes from the wet night stepped in, one tall and careful, the other small and wrapped in a hoodie several sizes too big. The taller man glanced at the empty chair, then at the photograph, then down at the floor, as if the room held a curious politeness he didn't know how to match. He was late 20s, maybe early 30s, with the tired, watchful energy of someone who had spent too many nights awake. His name, he would later say when his voice stopped sliding into apologies, was Daniel Morales. The boy with him had a scrappy crown of hair and the kind of serious eyes that belonged to children who had watched people keep their promises. Daniel moved toward the register like every step was measured against its embarrassment. "Sir," he said, his voice low and careful, "could you spare some change? For a coffee? For my son? Just anything?" Jack's hand paused over a rag. There was a reflex in him, habits formed from running a small place for 20 years. He kept a chipped tin cup by the door for coins. The ritual was as ordinary as towels and teaspoons. People left what they could. Sometimes coins clinked like small confessions. Sometimes bills were folded like urgent notes. Jack had been given his own share of hard nights, and the memory of Sarah's steady hands and whispered insistence, "Offer what you can, Jack, even if it's just soup," made him slide the cup toward Daniel. "Take a seat," Jack said. "You two look soaked. Come on in. Sit by the heater." The boy didn't wait for permission. He shook water from his hoodie and slid into a booth, hugging himself like a small animal.
Daniel hovered by the counter, looking apologetic enough to be almost gentle. Jack put a steaming mug of hot chocolate in front of the child and a bowl of soup in front of the man without asking. The steam fogged the window, and the smell of broth and cinnamon made the edges of the night soften. They ate in silence for a few minutes, spoon clinks and the low hiss of the espresso machine filling the pauses. The boy said thank you before the first bite, not because he had practiced it, but because he meant it. Something in that simple word loosened a memory in Jack, the way Sarah would catch a child with an unexpected kindness and make a scene out of nothing. He watched the child fold his small hands around the mug and felt the old pull of grief and an impulse toward repair. When the rush of late evening regulars thinned and the restaurant settled into its quieter rhythm, Maya, Jack's only full-time server, came around with the change cup as she always did. She tipped it out onto the counter to make room and mouthed to Jack, "Looks light." Coins rolled, silver and copper catching the warm light. But something folded beneath them caught Maya's eye. A small corner of paper, damp at the edges, tucked under the pennies like it had been placed there with the same careful modesty Daniel had used to ask for help. Maya's fingers teased at the paper, and she passed it to Jack without a word. The corner unfolded, a single creased scrap, slightly darkened at one edge by the rain. Jack read the short message aloud, the words coming out as if he had memorized them the moment his eyes hit the letters. "Please, my son is hungry and I have nowhere safe to sleep. Any help for tonight would mean everything. Daniel." The name on the paper landed with a new weight. The cup and the coins were ordinary. The note was not. It was urgent and plain and human in a way that cut through the automatic gestures of charity. Jack felt his throat tighten with something that was not quite sorrow and not quite resolve. He folded the note and placed it, carefully, beside Sarah's photograph on the counter. There was a tenderness in the gesture, as if he were showing her the small injustices of the city, and asking whether she would have kept the chair empty. He turned to Daniel, who was watching him as if waiting for permission to be offended at being noticed. "You two staying close to the corner?" Jack asked. He didn't say homeless, because words like that were blunt and often wrong. He asked where they were hoping to get tonight. Daniel hesitated. "Near 5th and Maple," he said finally. "But I can't stay there. It's not safe." "I was just trying." He looked at his son, and the man's voice folded with a lot unsaid. "I was trying not to ask in the door. I didn't want to make you—" "You're already in the door," Jack replied.
He left the sentence unfinished by design, filling the space with a bowl of stew that was too hot for polite conversation and a paper-wrapped sandwich for the boy. This was where the story could have ended. A coin, a cup, a few kind words, a warm night's meal. Many nights ended like this, simple mercies given and received, each person returning to their place in the city's complicated pattern. But the note made the encounter a little more demanding. It made the favor impossible to file under random kindness, and made Jack feel the old, quiet obligations of someone who had once been saved by another person's action. There was something else, too. Sarah. She had been a nurse who believed that small kindnesses mattered almost as much as medicine. Once, Jack remembered, he had watched her sit with an elderly woman on a park bench and listen to hours of gripe and small grief until the woman looked like she had swallowed back something painful, lighter. Sarah had kept an old, stubborn faith in people's capacity to try again. The photograph reminded Jack of that. The empty chair reminded him of the cost of doing nothing. Maya braced, perhaps expecting Jack to give a quarter, write a check, or offer a card that led nowhere. Instead, he set down a mug for Daniel and said quietly, "Would you mind telling me a little more? I have to close soon, but—" He didn't finish that sentence either, relying on the kind of trust that starts with a warm meal and a promise of listening. Daniel's story came out in pieces. He had been a baker at a local panaderia until the shop closed after a health inspector's fine compounded with an owner who owed more than he would ever pay. Jobs had dried up, rent had eaten his savings. He had left a relationship that had been angrier and less safe than the street, not wanting the boy to witness what he had. Daniel spoke of a night he'd spent in a bus shelter and of mornings when the city smelled like exhaust and regret. He spoke about how Ethan had once been called quiet at preschool because he watched too much and spoke too little, but that he could roll dough like a small master if given a rolling pin and a bowl. Jack listened without interruption, because what else do you do when someone hands you a life in fragments and asks you to fit them together? He watched Daniel's hands, calloused at the tip-tips, steady when he cradled his son's shoulder, and he remembered the steadiness of hands that could make an army of problems seem like a loaf rising in a warm room. "You don't want charity?" Jack asked, not making a speech but clarifying the shape of the request. Daniel's eyes thanked him. "No," Daniel said, "I don't want to be pitied. I'll work. I can do mornings at the cafe. I'm used to starting before dawn. I can keep things tidy. I can prepare dough. He stopped, not wanting to promise more than he could. Salt gathered in Jack's eyes for reasons he almost didn't understand. Maybe it was Sarah's voice, a memory that said, "If you can, give them a chance." Maybe it was the face of the child who had thanked them for hot chocolate, as if gratitude could anchor a life. Maybe it was the note itself, folded, damp, and terribly simple. Jack's answer was quiet and firm. "I have the apartment above the cafe," he said. It was small and rarely used, with a view of the back alley and a kettle that sometimes took longer than expected to whistle. "It's been empty for months. You can stay there while you get on your feet. And I'll give you mornings. Help reopen the place. Get the ovens running. You help me fix a few things I can't be up early enough for anymore." Daniel looked surprised, gratitude and disbelief fighting for space. He muttered, "I can't just—" "We'll make it a trade," Jack said. "You'll work for your room. No charity. We'll set a schedule. You get stability, we get a hand opening up mornings. Fair?" Daniel's shoulders dropped as if someone had taken a weight off. He nodded, a short, decisive move. "Fair," he said. Before they left that night, they walked upstairs together. The apartment smelled faintly of old bread and paint. There were 2 beds, a small table, a window that opened onto the alley where you could hear the city wash by. Jack pointed out the water heater and showed Daniel how to flip the breaker if the oven hiccuped. He left a bag of fresh bread in the kitchen,
Sarah's recipe for a simple loaf she had taught him to make on rainy evenings. The arrangements were practical and respectful. There would be no list of humiliations, no inspectors of dignity. Daniel would rise with the owls and tend the ovens. Ethan would finish his school registration with the help of a neighbor who volunteered at the district office. Jack drew up the schedule on a piece of scrap paper, wrote Daniel's name at the top, and taped it to the fridge. They left the note where Jack had placed it, between the photograph of Sarah and a jar of spoons, as if the small plea and the old nurse's laugh were in conversation. If you were watching from the sidewalk that January, you might have thought the neighborhood stayed the same shops opening at dawn, the same people carrying their coffees and their complaints. But small shifts started to appear. An extra broom left outside the cafe, the sound of a boy's laughter before school, the clatter of a rolling pin at 5 in the morning. A community changes faster than it admits, and slowly the city noticed Daniel's hands. The mornings were awkward at first. Daniel smelled of rain and city grime that didn't yet know the odor of bread. He arrived before sunrise, sleeves rolled, ready to learn the coffee machine's common injuries and how to coax the dough to behave. Jack watched him move around the kitchen like a man rediscovering a language he had once spoken fluently. There was a pride that rose in Jack like steam, proud in that old human way of watching someone else come alive.
Ethan settled into a small public school, where a teacher named Mrs. Patterson took an immediate shine to his careful manner. Mrs. Patterson signed him up for a breakfast program and offered tutoring. She also happened to be a regular at the cafe, and sometimes left casseroles on the counter with notes like, "For the family that smells like work and mornings." People began to bring small things: coat donations from Mrs. Kim down at the flower shop, an extra bike from Marcus the mechanic next door. These were not grand gestures, not headlines or miracles. They were the practical miracles of neighbors noticing and deciding, unremarkably, to help. Not everyone was convinced at first. Some regulars whispered doubts. Was it safe? Would the arrangement last? Jack had to answer a dozen small fears with a dozen small assurances. He introduced Daniel to the neighborhood slowly, as you introduce friends who had earned trust in private before they appear at family dinners. Daniel answered questions honestly, about his work history, about the safe places he had left, about the fact that he had once been a baker and that kneading bread had a way of steadying him. When he talked about baking, his voice warmed, and even the most skeptical listener caught himself picturing the simple acts of flour and water becoming something nourishing. The first paycheck was small and clumsy. Jack counted the numbers twice, as if habit would make them kinder. Daniel laughed and tucked the envelope into his jacket like a man carrying treasure. He used some to pay a clerk who helped expedite an ID, some to buy warmer clothes for Ethan. They were not gestures meant to make headlines. They were the private, stubborn work of putting a life back together. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel's presence became part of the cafe's rhythm. He started arriving before the coffee machine even thought of waking up. He swept floors, fed logs to the oven, and learned to time the bread so it came out just as the morning crowd filed in. He taught a few of the neighborhood kids how to shape rolls into hearts and stars, an act that made their faces unswallowingly proud. One afternoon, Mrs. Kim from across the street, who ran a tiny dumpling stand, stepped into the cafe with a tray of green tea and a proposition. She had noticed Daniel's skill with dough and the way customers happened to linger after discovering his bread. "You should sell these at the market," she told him. "We can arrange a spot on Saturday. No charge for the first month. See how it goes." Daniel hesitated in a way that carried the weight of doubt he had carried for so long. "I don't know how to run a stand," he said. "I don't have the money for materials." "You'll figure it out," Mrs. Kim said, as if she were naming a fact. "Between you and the cafe, someone will have the extra flour. Between Mrs. Patterson and Marcus, you'll find packaging. People like to help when they can do it without standing on ceremony."
And people did. A bit of flour appeared, left on the counter with a post-it that read, "From a friend." Paper bags with the cafe logo were donated by a print shop with an off day. A folding table was loaned by Marcus. It was not a sudden windfall or a cleaned-up montage moment. It was the neighborhood rearranging its generosity to fit a practical need. Daniel showed up to the market the first Saturday with a crate of rolls and a sign that read, "Ethan's Morning Bread." He sold out by noon and kept his hands busy answering the questions of customers who wanted to know his secret recipe. He told them, in the way bakers do, that the dough needed patience and a little stubbornness. The community's suspicion softened into curiosity, then into respect, as people watched Daniel work
and saw a man who guarded his dignity even while accepting help. Parents who once eyed him with caution offered to spread the word about a job opening. Mrs. Patterson recommended him for an after-school program where he could teach the children basic baking. Daniel's confidence grew, and with it the tangible signs of a life being rebuilt. A modest savings account opened at the advice of a neighbor. Ethan's first backpack with a superhero patch. A name on a lease that made him feel less as if he was borrowing air. There were setbacks, of course. Old paperwork refused to be clear, a sudden freezer repair stitched an extra cost into the week, and sometimes the past caught at Daniel's heels with a memory of nights he had spent in places that did not hold his child's safety. But the pattern of support held. When a late December freeze hit, the cafe handed out extra blankets, and the neighborhood organized a drive for warm socks. Marcus fixed the heater in Daniel's apartment for half the price, because Marcus said later that he had been where Daniel was once, and someone had slid him a hand just like that. The real turning point came quietly, not in a speech or a ribbon cutting, but in the bright chaos of a Tuesday morning when the little market across the street buzzed with people who had never before considered the difference between giving and restoring. Daniel had set up a small stall where he sold crusty rolls and cinnamon tarts he twisted just so. Parents from the school came to buy a loaf and lingered longer than they needed to, chatting about after-school programs. A woman stopped and told him that her own husband had once been a baker, and how seeing Daniel made her think of second chances. By then, it was no longer just Jack's experiment. It had become a modest example of what a community could do when it saw a person who wanted to work and let them. The holiday that followed marked a new chapter. Jack proposed a community meal, free, but put together with a dignity that made it feel like the center of something real rather than a charity distribution. Daniel would provide the bread. Jack would coordinate food from the kitchen. Mrs.
Patterson would recruit volunteers. Mrs. Kim offered dumplings. Marcus arranged for folding chairs. The meal was called simply the winter table. On the night of the winter table, the cafe smelled like 1,000 small comforts. Tables were laden with pots and platters, steam rising in soft, hungry clouds. The room filled with neighbors who had, at one point, been strangers. Some came with casseroles, some with anecdotes about Daniel's first clumsy loaves. Some came hand in hand with neighbors they had known for years. There were no banners and no speeches, only the clatter of plates and the kind of conversation that repairs what is frayed. At one table sat an elderly man who had once refused to look at the homeless, now eating at the same line as the father who had once asked for spare change. At another, a young mother who had been given a handful of help years before knelt to offer peanut butter sandwiches. Ethan sprinted between the legs of chairs, ferrying pieces of bread with the solemnity of a small altar boy. Daniel moved through the room like someone carrying his gratitude in his hands, making sure no one was left standing under the lights. Near the end of the evening, Jack found himself standing by the corner table with the empty chair. He had not intended to take a seat, only to watch. The photograph of Sarah seemed especially luminous that night, lit by the soft glow of the lights. A woman he recognized from the market came and set down a small wooden plaque near the photograph. Carved on it were the words, "The cup that was shared." The plaque was a quiet joke, and an even quieter ode, and Jack felt the familiar tightness in his chest that was almost like prayer. Daniel had been asked to say a few words, not as a speech but as a courtesy. He cleared his throat in that way that showed a man hadn't needed to stand in front of crowds for a while. He didn't say anything dramatic. Instead, he kept it human and true. Short sentences stitched with simple thanks. "I asked for a coin that night," he said, his voice steady now. "I got a bowl of soup and a place to sleep and a job. I got a neighborhood. I didn't plan to stay. I planned to survive. But you all let me try. For my son, that made everything." There were quiet noises then, small things of agreement and the scraping of chairs. A woman in the back said, "To Ethan's bread." People raised small glasses of cider, and the room hummed like a living thing. That evening, as plates were cleared and leftovers boxed, Jack took the little cup from where it had sat by the register. The coins had been spent on supplies for the winter table, flour, extra milk, candles, and the note lay folded inside a small glass frame now, preserved in the way a keespake is preserved. He placed it beside Sarah's photograph. It was more than a relic of the night. It had become a starting point, a physical memory of the choice he had made.
He told Daniel as much in a way that was less sentimental and more factual. "I'm keeping the note," he said. "It belongs near where we make things. I want to see it when I open the door in the dark. I'll know why we're here." Daniel nodded, and for a second Jack saw the relief in that nod, A man finally allowed to have his life not dismissed as random or inevitable, but treated as a thing worth patching. Time had a way of smoothing edges and sharpening other things. The empty chair at the corner table was still technically empty, but it was full of the sound of laughter carried across the room, and of someone slipping into the seat to pay for a coffee in honor of a woman who had once believed that every person deserved to be noticed. Sarah's photograph looked less like a portrait of a life ended and more like a murmur that had found its echo, a memory that kept people honest about kindness. Daniel's small baking stall found its place in the weekend market. He hired a young neighbor who needed work and taught him how to make rolls that came out with the perfect crackle. Ethan's school sent home art that was pinned to the cafe's notice board: crayon suns, lopsided houses, notes that said, "Thank you for our bread." Marcus fixed the gutter outside for free one Saturday because he liked the way the rain pooled and thought of the first night when a scrap of paper had changed a path. The ripple went outward in practical ways more than poetic ones. Mrs. Patterson started a scholarship fund to help families buy supplies for vocational training. The cafe partnered with a night shelter to provide leftover meals rather than throw them away at the end of the day. People found, in the daily small acts, a model that made them less afraid of the homeless and more willing to see the human detail in the stranger. Jack found a kind of quiet peace in the change. He did not feel absolved. He still missed Sarah with an ache that returned sometimes when he washed dishes or left extra sugar for a stranger. But he felt connected to something Sarah had long insisted on, that what you do with what you have is often more important than the size of what you have. When he caught himself at the sink, watching the soap bubble and the city rain ripple outside the window, he would glance at the note in its glass frame and remember the line that had started it all. Years later, the note remained a small sacred thing behind the register. It had faded at the edges but never lost its urgency. Whenever they rearranged the counter, someone would always pick it up and read it aloud, and the room would hush as if remembering how quickly life can turn when someone decides to answer a simple, desperate sentence. One winter evening, when the market lights glittered like watchful eyes and the air had that brittle, hopeful cold to it, Jack sat in the corner chair, not as the empty placeholder, but as someone who had been witness. Daniel walked in with Ethan, now taller and having outgrown that too-big hoodie. He carried a tray of rolls and, with a small flourish, more practiced than theatrical, placed them on the counter. "You still keep the note?" Daniel asked. Jack picked the glass frame up and handed it across the counter. The note had been tucked into a small wooden box beneath the register, safe and close, as if it needed to be shuffled out from time to time, like a secret. "I do," Jack said. "Reminds me what to do in small moments." Daniel set the roll down and glanced toward Sarah's photo. "She would have liked Ethan," he said. "He's got a stubbornness like a good loaf, won't give up rising." Jack laughed softly. She liked stubbornness, said it was what keeps people alive. Around them, the cafe hummed with a life that felt intentionally lived. Regulars who had once peered sideways now shared tables with new faces. The empty chair was still slightly wobbly, but it bore the gentle scars of stories. People left notes on it sometimes, a thank you, a memory, a recipe, small ways of adding to the ledger of kindness. Every so often, children would stand on tiptoe at the counter and ask Jack why there was a tiny scrap of paper in a frame. He would tell them what had happened as simply as the story deserved, and no more. Once upon a time, he would say, "A man asked for some change. We gave him a chance." The children would nod at the simplicity, as children do, and move on with the solemnity of small witnesses. The plaque, the cup that was shared, hung by the photo. Some would call it sappy, others sentimental. Jack called it a compass. When the cafe was crowded and the nights were long, and he felt the old hollow of grief expand, he would look at that little plaque and the framed note and remember that the measure of a life was often in the small, consistent acts of mercy. What began with a folded scrap of paper and a cup for coins became, in the slow work of months, a modest reweaving of a community. Daniel's life did not flip into sudden fortune. It moved into the steady lane of work, of apprenticeships, of being allowed to make mistakes and then try again. Ethan grew into a boy who trusted that adults could be kind. He learned to lace shoes and tie knots, and to complain when flour got into his hair because he had learned how the work felt. Neighbors found ways to serve with dignity, aligning help with skill and opportunity rather than charity that removed choice. If there was a theology here, it was humbly practical. Dignity tended to be restored when people were given work and welcome rather than pity and erasure. That truth was not announced from any pulpit, but shown in the day-to-day acts.
someone giving an extra bag of flour, a teacher enrolling a child in a program, a barista sliding a free cup of soup across the counter in cold weather.
Years later, on a thin March morning when the city was waking slow, Jack found a letter on the back of an order form tucked into the book where he kept receipts. The letter was from a woman in Idaho, a stranger, who had read a small column about the winter table and decided to donate a modest sum to the scholarship fund Mrs. Patterson had started. "Your town shows that people do care," she wrote. "I wanted to help someone else see that." Jack folded the letter and slipped it into the jar where patrons dropped coins for the local shelter. He looked at the photograph of Sarah and the framed note and felt, without theatrics, the warmth of a life that had been allowed to keep giving in the name of someone who once believed in small kindnesses. There were no grand proclamations, no miraculous transformations from the pages of a book. There were bread recipes perfected by patient hands, a boy who finally learned to sing with others in a school choir, a man who discovered that waking before dawn could steady his heart. There was, most of all, a slow unwinding of the idea that help must always degrade its receiver. Here, help came as opportunity and neighborliness, and with it a chance to be more than an identifier. The cup with the note sat behind the counter like a talisman that had never asked to be one. Jack kept it in the same place he always had, carefully angled so the words could still be read if you looked closely. People sometimes asked about it, and he would tell them the story as plainly as it could be told. A man asked for spare change. A note said a boy was hungry. Someone chose to do more than give coins. The listeners would nod, pocketing the small moral as people do. Some would leave with plans to volunteer, some with a whispered promise to be kinder in the mornings. On a slow afternoon, when the rain was only a memory and sunlight pooled warm on the floorboards, Jack sat in the corner chair that had once been empty and let the room breathe around him. He thought of Sarah with a clarity that was not raw, but weathered, like a shoreline that had been shaped by many storms. She had taught him, in the way all living teachers do, that compassion is not a single act, but a lifetime of small choices. He ran a finger along the frame of the kept note and smiled without thinking. The room filled with the quiet clatter of life, the hiss of the espresso machine, a child's laugh, the murmur of neighbors sharing stories. The empty chair held the imprint of a woman who had loved that new life into being. It was no longer simply a symbol of loss. It was part of the scaffolding for what came after. If you ever stopped by that cafe, you might see the little glass frame and assume it was just an odd piece of memorabilia. If you asked Jack about it, he would probably tell you the short, humble truth. He would tell you that a man named Daniel once asked for spare change, that he found a note folded under the coins, and that the person who found it decided, in a small, stubborn way, to do a little more. He would say that kindness rippled outward in ways both expected and surprising, and that a neighborhood learned to hold people up instead of looking away. And if you felt moved when you heard that story, moved to think about how you might offer practical kindness in your own place, there were 100 small ways to start. A loaf of bread left for someone in need, an offer of a morning shift to someone who wanted to work, a volunteer hour at a local shelter. These things were not cures, not miracles promised. They were, simply, actions with the power to change days, and sometimes, if you were lucky and persistent, lives. Jack kept the note where it would be seen, where it could still do the work it had begun the night rain tapped the windows, and a father asked, with the dignity of a man protecting his child, for just a little help. The scrap of paper remained a reminder that the most honest question a person can ask often needs nothing more than someone willing to listen, and then, when listening has been done, to act. If this story touched you, consider offering your time or resources to a local shelter or community meal program. Even the smallest gesture, an hour, a loaf, a donation, can start a ripple where you live. And when you pass a cup by a storefront, look a little closer. Sometimes what you see tucked beneath the coins is a life asking not for pity, but for a chance.